The pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944, hung like a shroud over the English Channel as thousands of Allied vessels cut through the churning waters toward the coast of Nazi-occupied France. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder gripped the rail of his landing craft, watching the pale outline of Pointe du Hoc emerge from the morning mist like the jagged teeth of some primordial beast. Behind him, 225 men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion prepared for what many believed would be their final moments on Earth. The sound of aircraft engines thundered overhead as waves of Allied bombers and fighters swept toward the Norman coastline. Operation Overlord, the largest seaborne invasion in military history, was about to begin. For 3 years, the fate of Europe had hung in the balance, with Nazi Germany's iron grip tightening across the continent. Now, on this gray morning, the destiny of millions would be decided on the beaches and bluffs of Normandy. As referenced in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive historical account, D-Day, June 6, 1944, the climactic battle of World War II. The stakes could not have been higher for the Allied forces preparing to storm Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Rudder's Rangers had drawn one of the most perilous assignments of the entire operation. Their mission: scale the 100-foot cliffs of Pointe du Hoc under enemy fire and destroy the massive German artillery pieces that could rain death upon the invasion fleet. Intelligence reports indicated that 6 155mm guns were positioned atop the promontory, capable of striking both Omaha and Utah beaches with devastating effect. The young officer from Texas had volunteered for this suicide mission, knowing full well that casualties would be catastrophic. Military planners estimated that 70% of his men would not survive the first hour. Yet here they were, racing toward the cliffs in the gray light of dawn, their faces blackened with camouflage paint, their hearts pounding with a mixture of terror and determination. Behind them, the largest armada ever assembled stretched to the horizon. 5,000 ships carried over 150,000 men toward 5 code-named beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. American, British, Canadian, and Free French forces prepared to breach Hitler's supposedly impregnable fortress Europe. The success or failure of this single day would determine whether Nazi tyranny would be broken or whether the Allies would face another bloody stalemate. The German defenders, commanded by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had spent months preparing for this moment. The Desert Fox had overseen the construction of formidable beach obstacles, minefields, and concrete bunkers. Thousands of steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes, and Belgian gates waited beneath the waves to tear apart landing craft. Machine gun nests and artillery positions commanded every approach to the beaches. As Rudder's craft approached the base of the cliffs, German sentries spotted the incoming Rangers. Flares burst overhead, bathing the scene in hellish red light. Machine gun fire erupted from concealed positions, sending deadly streams of bullets whistling past the Americans' heads. Mortar shells began exploding in the water around them, sending up towering geysers of spray. The moment of truth had arrived. Everything that had led to this instant, the years of planning, training, and sacrifice, would be decided in the next few hours. The liberation of Europe hung in the balance. The first landing craft struck the rocky beach at the base of Pointe du Hoc at 0630 hours. Immediately, a withering hail of machine gun fire swept across the narrow strip of sand and stone. Rangers leapt from their boats into the churning surf, some falling before their boots touched French soil. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder splashed through the icy water, shouting orders over the deafening crack of rifle fire and the explosive roar of German artillery. Sergeant Leonard Lommel, a tough coal miner from New Jersey, rallied his section and began firing the rocket-propelled grappling hooks that would carry climbing ropes to the cliff top. The first volley fell short, the ropes severed by enemy fire or weighted down by seawater. German defenders above hurled potato masher grenades down at the Americans, the explosion sending showers of rock and shrapnel across the beach. The cliffs loomed above them like an impossible wall. Vertical limestone faces, scarred by centuries of channel storms, rose 100 feet into the gray morning sky. At the summit, German soldiers in field gray uniforms peered down at the struggling Americans, picking their targets with methodical precision. Every second that passed brought more casualties to the already decimated Ranger force. Lommel managed to get his second rocket fired, this time watching with grim satisfaction as the grappling hook caught on a concrete fortification. At the cliff edge, under covering fire from his squadmates, he began the perilous ascent, hand over hand up the swaying rope while bullets whined past his head. Other Rangers followed suit, their heavy equipment packs threatening to drag them into the abyss with each labored pull upward. German defenders tried desperately to cut the climbing ropes. Steel bayonets sawed frantically at the thick hemp lines while Rangers below fired their Thompson submachine guns upward, trying to suppress the enemy positions. One by one, the American assault troops hauled themselves up the cliff face, their uniforms torn and bloodied from the sharp limestone edges. Private First Class Carl Wiest from Ohio made it halfway up his rope before a German grenade exploded nearby, sending rock fragments slicing through his left shoulder. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he continued climbing, leaving a trail of blood on the rope below him. This was no time for weakness or surrender. Too much depended on their success. By 0700 hours, the first Rangers had reached the cliff top, immediately coming under intense small arms fire from prepared German positions. They found themselves in a moonscape of massive bomb craters created by the pre-invasion air bombardment. The landscape had been utterly transformed into a hellish terrain of broken concrete, twisted metal, and churned earth. Rudder established his command post in a shell crater 20 yards from the cliff edge, attempting to coordinate his scattered forces while under constant fire. Radio communication with the invasion fleet remained sporadic due to damaged equipment and German jamming efforts. The Rangers were essentially on their own, cut off from reinforcement and resupply. The most shocking discovery came when Lommel and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn reached the gun positions that had been their primary objective. The massive artillery pieces were nowhere to be found. In their place stood wooden decoys and telephone poles, an elaborate deception that had fooled Allied intelligence for months. The real guns had been moved inland, safely hidden in camouflaged positions beyond the reach of naval bombardment. Despite this setback, the Rangers pressed forward with grim determination. Their secondary mission remained critical: hold the high ground and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the main invasion beaches. Every minute they could delay enemy counterattacks would give the forces at Omaha and Utah Beach precious time to establish their foothold on European soil. While Rangers scaled the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc, the main assault force approached the most deadly of all the landing zones. Omaha Beach stretched for 6 miles between the Vire River and Port-en-Bessin, its gently sloping sands deceptively peaceful in the early morning light. Behind the beach rose steep bluffs, honeycombed with German defensive positions that would soon earn this stretch of Norman coastline its grim nickname, Bloody Omaha. The 1st Infantry Division, veterans of campaigns in North Africa and Sicily, led the assault alongside the untested 29th Infantry Division. These men, crowded into their landing craft and sick from hours of rough seas, had no idea of the hell that awaited them. German Field Marshal Rommel had personally overseen the fortification of this sector, creating what he believed to be an impregnable killing ground. At 0630 hours, the first wave of assault troops hit the beach. Immediately, the carefully planned operation began to unravel. Strong currents had pushed many landing craft off course, depositing soldiers far from their intended objectives. Units became scattered and disorganized before the battle had even begun. Worse still, the pre-invasion naval bombardment had failed to suppress the German defenses, leaving most enemy positions intact and fully manned. Captain John Spaulding of the 16th Infantry Regiment watched in horror as machine gun fire from the WN-72 strongpoint raked across his landing craft. Men fell screaming into the bloody surf before they could even reach the sand. Those who made it to the beach found themselves pinned down in the open, with no cover except the bodies of their fallen comrades. The German defenders, members of the elite 352nd Infantry Division, had spent months preparing for this moment. Their positions were perfectly sited to create interlocking fields of fire across every inch of the beach. From concrete bunkers and camouflaged rifle pits, they poured a devastating volume of fire into the advancing Americans. Artillery observers in church steeples and clifftop observation posts called down precision strikes on any group of soldiers that tried to advance. Sergeant Philip Strechik from Chicago led his squad across the beach in a desperate dash for the seawall, the only cover available in the deadly open ground. Mortar shells exploded around them, sending up geysers of sand and twisted metal. Of the 12 men who had started the charge, only 4 reached the dubious safety of the concrete barrier. Behind them, the beach was becoming a charnel house. Wounded men cried out for medics who were themselves pinned down by enemy fire. Landing craft continued to arrive, disgorging more soldiers into the meat grinder. Some units suffered 90% casualties in the first 10 minutes of the assault. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment was virtually annihilated before its men could advance 50 yards from the water's edge. General Omar Bradley, commanding the First Army from his flagship, watched the disaster unfold through binoculars. Radio reports painted an increasingly desperate picture. Units were scattered, communications broken, and casualties mounting by the minute. At 0830 hours, he seriously considered calling off the assault and evacuating the survivors. The invasion of Europe seemed to be collapsing in blood and chaos on the sands of Omaha Beach. Yet even in this darkest hour, individual acts of courage began to turn the tide. Brigadier General Norman Cota of the 29th Division personally led small groups of soldiers in attacks on German positions. "Rangers, lead the way!" he shouted as he rallied scattered troops for another assault. His personal example inspired others to rise from behind whatever cover they could find and continue the attack. As the morning sun climbed higher over the blood-stained sands of Omaha Beach, scattered groups of American soldiers began the slow, deadly process of breaking through German defenses. The massive invasion plan had dissolved into countless individual firefights, with small units of infantrymen clawing their way forward yard by yard against determined resistance. Staff Sergeant Harrison Summers of the 101st Airborne Division found himself leading a mixed group of paratroopers and infantrymen who had been dropped far from their intended landing zones during the pre-dawn airborne assault. With characteristic determination, Summers organized his makeshift force for an attack on a German strongpoint blocking the approach to the village of Sainte-Mère-Église. The German position consisted of 4 stone buildings connected by trenches and wire obstacles. Machine gun teams in each structure could support each other with crossfire, creating a deadly trap for any attacking force. Summers studied the position carefully, knowing that a frontal assault would be suicide. Instead, he decided on a series of individual attacks, using stealth and surprise to eliminate each building in sequence. Moving like a ghost through the Norman hedgerows, Summers approached the first building alone. He kicked in the door and sprayed the interior with submachine gun fire, eliminating the 6-man German team before they could react. Without pausing, he moved to the second position, again attacking single-handedly while his men provided covering fire from concealed positions. The third building proved more challenging. As Summers approached, German defenders spotted him and opened fire. Bullets shattered the stone walls around him as he dove for cover. For 20 minutes, he engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse, with the enemy soldiers finally managing to work close enough to throw a grenade through a window. The explosion silenced the position. By the time Summers finished clearing all 4 buildings, he had personally killed over 30 German soldiers in hand-to-hand combat. His actions opened a crucial gap in enemy defenses, allowing other American units to advance inland from the beaches. When asked later about his extraordinary feat, the quiet soldier from West Virginia simply said he was doing his job. Meanwhile, at Pointe du Hoc, the surviving Rangers continued their desperate fight to hold the clifftop positions. By noon, on June 6th, Lieutenant Colonel Rudder had only 90 men left from his original force of 225. German counterattacks came with increasing frequency and intensity as enemy commanders realized the strategic importance of the position. Sergeant Leonard Lommel and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn embarked on a reconnaissance patrol inland, still searching for the missing German artillery pieces. Moving carefully through the cratered landscape, they discovered a camouflaged road leading away from the coast. Following this track for over a mile, they finally located the guns they had been sent to destroy. The 6 massive artillery pieces sat in a hidden position, perfectly camouflaged and ready to rain destruction on the invasion beaches. More importantly, they appeared to be unguarded. The German crews had apparently been called away to deal with other threats, leaving their weapons temporarily unmanned. It was an opportunity that might never come again. Working quickly and quietly, Lommel and Kuhn used thermite grenades to destroy the firing mechanisms of all 6 guns. They also damaged ammunition supplies and cut telephone lines connecting the position to German command posts. Their mission, bought with so much blood and sacrifice at Pointe du Hoc, was finally complete. Back on Omaha Beach, the tide of battle slowly began to turn as more American units gained footholds in the German defenses. Combat engineers braved enemy fire to clear beach obstacles and create paths for vehicles and supplies. Naval gunfire, finally coordinated effectively with ground observers, began systematically destroying enemy strongpoints that had held up the advance for hours. Captain Joe Dawson of the 16th Infantry Regiment led his company in a daring assault up the bluffs overlooking the beach. Using Bangalore torpedoes to blast through wire obstacles and small unit tactics learned in training, his men managed to outflank several German positions. By mid-afternoon, they had established a precarious foothold on the high ground, providing covering fire for other units still struggling to advance from the beach. As June 6th transitioned into evening, the character of the battle began to change dramatically. What had started as a desperate struggle for survival was gradually becoming a methodical expansion of Allied beachheads. Reinforcements poured ashore in increasing numbers, bringing heavy weapons, ammunition, and the supplies necessary to sustain a prolonged campaign. At Utah Beach, the westernmost landing site, American forces had achieved remarkable success compared to the carnage at Omaha. The 4th Infantry Division, led by Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., had landed with relatively light casualties and quickly pushed inland. Roosevelt, the 56-year-old son of the former president, had insisted on landing with the first wave despite his age and poor health. Walking with a cane due to old wounds and arthritis, Roosevelt moved among his troops with calm determination, personally directing the deployment of units and coordinating with Navy beachmasters to organize the flow of supplies. His presence provided a steadying influence on younger soldiers experiencing their first taste of combat. "We'll start the war from right here," he declared, when informed that currents had pushed the landing force nearly a mile off course. The success at Utah Beach was crucial for linking up with airborne forces scattered across the Cottontaine Peninsula. Elements of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had been fighting isolated actions since the pre-dawn hours, seizing key bridges and road junctions to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment found himself commanding a mixed force of paratroopers near the village of Saint-Côme-du-Mont. His mission was to capture and hold a strategic causeway that connected Utah Beach with inland objectives. German defenders had established strong positions in the surrounding farmhouses and hedgerows, creating a complex defensive network that would require careful coordination to overcome. Cole's attack began at dawn on June 7th, with multiple companies advancing simultaneously against different objectives. The fighting was brutal and personal, often conducted at ranges measured in yards rather than hundreds of meters. American paratroopers, trained for this type of close combat, gradually worked their way through the German positions using grenades, bayonets, and raw courage. The Norman hedgerow country proved to be a defender's paradise. Ancient stone walls topped with thick vegetation created natural fortifications every few hundred yards. German machine gun teams could establish positions with excellent fields of fire, then withdraw through concealed routes when American forces attempted to outflank them. Progress was measured in individual fields rather than miles. Sergeant Bill Guarnere from South Philadelphia led his squad through this green hell, using tactics developed through bitter experience. Each hedgerow required careful reconnaissance, followed by coordinated attacks that combined rifle fire, automatic weapons, and explosive charges. Casualties mounted steadily as American units learned the deadly lessons of bocage warfare. Meanwhile, at the eastern end of the invasion front, British and Canadian forces fought their own desperate battles to expand their beachheads. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division had landed at Juno Beach, with the ambitious objective of capturing the city of Caen by nightfall on June 6th. German resistance proved far stronger than anticipated, with elite SS Panzer divisions moving quickly to contain the Allied advance. Major John Folds of the Highland Light Infantry found his battalion engaged in house-to-house fighting in the village of Bernières-sur-Mer. German paratroopers of the 3rd Parachute Division had established defensive positions in the stone buildings, creating a series of mutually supporting strongpoints that had to be cleared individually. The fighting was vicious and prolonged, with no quarter asked or given by either side. British Royal Engineers worked frantically to clear beach obstacles and create viable supply routes inland. Specialized equipment, including flame-throwing tanks and bridge-laying vehicles, gradually tilted the balance in favor of the attackers. By evening on June 6th, all 5 invasion beaches had been secured, though at costs far higher than pre-invasion estimates had predicted. The German response was confused and ineffective, hampered by Hitler's insistence on personal control over armored reserves and poor communication between scattered defensive units. Field Marshal Rommel was in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday, while other senior commanders remained convinced that the Normandy landings were merely a diversion from the main attack expected at Pas de Calais. The sun set on June 6, 1944, illuminating a transformed coastline. Where German concrete and steel had dominated the Norman beaches that morning, Allied flags now flew over hastily established command posts. The impossible had been accomplished, but at a terrible price. Over 10,000 Allied casualties marked the cost of this single day's fighting, each representing a life cut short in the service of freedom. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder's Rangers at Pointe du Hoc epitomized both the sacrifice and success of Operation Overlord. Of the 225 men who had scaled the cliffs that morning, only 90 remained effective by nightfall. They held their positions through the night of June 6th and all of June 7th, repelling repeated German counterattacks with dwindling ammunition and no prospect of immediate relief. Relief finally came on the afternoon of June 8th, when elements of the 5th Ranger Battalion fought their way inland from Omaha Beach. The survivors of Pointe du Hoc looked like scarecrows, their uniforms torn and blood-stained, their faces drawn with exhaustion. Yet, they had accomplished their mission, denying the enemy use of the strategic position and contributing to the overall success of the invasion. Sergeant Leonard Lommel, whose destruction of the German artillery pieces had saved countless lives on the invasion beaches, received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions. Years later, military historians would conclude that his individual initiative may have been one of the most significant single acts of the entire D-Day operation. The guns he destroyed could have devastated the landing forces during their most vulnerable hours. The broader implications of the Normandy invasion extended far beyond the immediate tactical success. Hitler's Atlantic Wall, proclaimed to be impregnable, had been breached in a single day. German confidence in their defensive capabilities was shattered, while Allied morale soared to new heights. The second front that Stalin had long demanded was finally established, forcing Germany to fight a two-front war that would ultimately prove unsustainable. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, returning hastily from Germany, surveyed the disaster with growing despair. His carefully constructed defenses had been overwhelmed by Allied determination and superior logistics. The mobile defense he had advocated, using armored reserves to drive the invaders back into the sea, had been prevented by Hitler's interference, and the devastating effect of Allied air power on German communications. Within a week of the initial landings, over 300,000 Allied troops were ashore in Normandy, supported by 50,000 vehicles and over 100,000 tons of supplies. The artificial harbors, codenamed mulberries, were operational despite damage from channel storms. A continuous stream of reinforcements flowed across the expanding beachheads, building combat strength faster than German forces could respond. The Norman campaign would continue for 2 more months, with fierce fighting in the hedgerow country testing Allied resolve and tactical adaptability. The breakout at Saint-Lô in late July would finally shatter German defensive lines, leading to the encirclement of enemy forces in the Falaise Pocket and the liberation of Paris in August. But it all began on June 6th, with the courage of ordinary soldiers facing extraordinary challenges. Captain John Spaulding, who had survived the hell of Omaha Beach, reflected years later on the significance of that terrible day. "We weren't heroes," he said. "We were just scared kids doing what had to be done. But maybe that's what heroism really is. Ordinary people rising to meet extraordinary circumstances." The Battle of Normandy proved that democracy, when tested to its limits, could produce warriors equal to any challenge. The free nations of the world had demonstrated their capacity for sacrifice and their commitment to human dignity. From the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc to the sands of Omaha Beach, a generation of young Americans, British, Canadians, and Free French soldiers had written their names in history with blood and courage. The price of freedom had been paid in full on the beaches of Normandy. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich would last barely another 11 months, crumbling under the weight of Allied victory and the consequences of its own evil. The longest day had indeed become the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, and the dawn of liberation for enslaved Europe.